Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first curmudgeonly conversation of the Oakland Macomb Campaign for Liberty. And thanks to John and Kathy Irvine, who have this deluxe studio here, we're able to reach out to like-minded lovers of liberty to discuss topics of great interest. What are our problems? What are our opportunities? And how might we solve some of the problems that we're facing today and actually live in a free society? And we're very pleased for the first guest in this show, in our inaugural episode, to have the very distinguished Mark Kreslins of Oklahoma, formerly of Maryland, former talk show host, one of the hosts of the Forgotten Men show, which was an outstanding show that he did along with Joshua Lyons and Scott Strelchek. Mark has also been a congressional aide to 2 United States congressmen, and he's extremely well versed in all of the philosophical and practical and political issues that we need to be concerned with. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's say hello to our good friend, Mark Kreslins. Mark?
Hey, Dennis, thank you so much for that very humbling introduction. I'm not quite sure I'm deserving of most of it. I stand on much greater shoulders in what I discuss. And so I am truly grateful to be here with you, Dennis. And we've had a relationship for years, going all the way back to the Forgotten Men show, back in the early 2010 area, 2011 era,
Yes.
In that period. And so you and I have been palling around for quite some time, and I'm totally honored to be on your show here tonight.
Well, the honor is ours, Mark, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And we're looking forward to helping to spread the message of what you discuss and share your knowledge with our friends here in the great state of Michigan and onward as we go forward from this point.
Yeah.
Well, I just going to say, Mark, today is a very propitious day for us to do this, isn't it? It's July 2nd, and it's the anniversary of the Lee Resolution. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, so this really is the beginning of our Declaration of Independence. Obviously, we all celebrated on Thursday, and that's the common date that we use. But it really begins with Richard Henry Lee and his statement about the states being free and independent, and this whole idea. But there's really a tremendous amount of background that leads up to this July 2nd. And it's a conversation that I try to have on my Facebook page with people ongoing, because there's always a lot more. We tend to pinpoint dates and think that that's kind of where it all came together, and it never really actually does all come together on one day. It's a building block, really, that in many ways began all the way back in 1733 with the Molasses Act being really the first sense that the colonists were going to be taxed or kind of under the possession of the king at that point. And from that point forward, you see this kind of steady increase of revulsion to the idea that the king is going to begin to really put pressure on them as colonists to begin to pay taxes, live under regulations, and he was truly going to be their king. And why is this important? Because I think we tend to think about dates, we forget the time that takes to build to those dates. And Dennis, that's exactly where we are today. We're building for a date in the future we don't yet know, where freedom can be restored. We happen to be at the very beginnings. We're kind of at our 1733 period right now. We may be at our 1738 or 1743 period, but we're not yet at 1776 where we can restore freedom. Now, why is that important in our discussion today and most of the work that I'm involved in right now? Because I think as a people, we tend to be pretty impulsive, especially in the American context today, where we can literally get anything in a matter of minutes. We now have Amazon delivering products via drones, literally within hours of the moment you order them. And so there's almost a psyche that's developed, and I see this in politics as well. I see this kind of almost position that we embrace, that we should be able to do this tomorrow with technology and social media and all that. Well, the reality is you can't. You gotta persuade people to release their old paradigm and embrace a new paradigm. Now let's look at their paradigm back in 1733. This is only, probably 110 years after they land in Plymouth and Jamestown, right? So they're not there a long time. They're just, we tend to lose perspective that these are small colonies. These are a couple of million people spread out along the entire East Coast there, and they actually want the king's protections. They've got the Indians they're dealing with. They've got the French that are there. The Spaniards are there, and there's all this kind of competition going on for ownership of the land. And so many of them have come from England, and they're loyal subjects to the king. They love their king. Well, imagine the paradigm shift they had to go through from 1733 to 1776, where they're now saying, we're going to revolt against the king. Well, it's a paradigm shift we're going through right now, and it's hard. This is the hard work of propaganda. This is the hard work of arguments, making good arguments, often relying more on philosophical ideas than necessarily constitutional or legal ideas. And we're at that 1733, 1738, 1745 period. We're somewhere in there. But what I'm seeing, Dennis, and I think you're seeing it as well, is more and more people are willing to entertain the idea that the real solution to our problem is more likely contained in the Declaration of Independence, the very thing we're going to be celebrating these next few days, versus the Constitution. Now, that's a difficult paradigm, especially for conservatives to even begin to consider. And as you see, and I get a lot of pushback on this, and people, I've got some people very angry at me right now because I make assertions like that really our path forward is better found in the Declaration and the principles contained therein versus a regular argument about constitutionalism. And we can talk about that to whatever degree you want to, Dennis, but I think this is a wonderful day to be starting your program when we think about independence. And does that have application today? If I've seen anything in my career since working on Capitol Hill back in the 80s when President Reagan was in power, and we were in the minority in the House. I happened to work in the House, and so, Dennis, I got a firsthand view of how the sausage is made, and I can't tell you back then I was of the mindset I am now. In fact, I wasn't. I was someone who saw the pragmatic side of politics and could care less about what the Constitution did or did not say, and none of us did up there. Quite honestly, if the people only knew how legislation really occurred, there would have been a overthrow of the government by now, if you will. There would have been a peaceful revolution. But people don't know. They believe a lot of what they hear on the campaign trail. And politicians are very skilled at saying what needs to be said. Let's be honest. That's kind of their skill set. And so. But having been in the belly of the beast to see how legislation really comes about and how little people, we paid no attention, Dennis, to the Constitution. Not one time in my time on Capitol Hill did I ever pull out my pocket Constitution that I didn't even have and decide whether or not this particular piece of legislation I was going to be advising the congressman on or he was going to be voting on. Never once did we pull out the Constitution and say, do we have any authority to do this? Never once. And it wasn't just my office. It's just not how the game is played there. And again, I think if people really understood that, they would by now have voted a whole new model in there, because this one isn't working for us. It's working for them, and it's working for the interests they represent, but it's not working for us. And so starting your show here with this, on this day that we celebrate is a day that we got our evidence or our independence from another central power, which was the king. I think it's very fitting, Dennis, that you're headed down this road to begin to think about how do we get free again, because we aren't free. I mean, we can say we're free all we want until April 15th. Then we quickly figure out we're not that free. We can say we're free all we want until we find out that the NSA has access to what we're doing here today. We have We are only as free as they allow us to be free. And quite honestly, as we begin to see the continuing expansion of federal power, we aren't that free. But there's something in us, isn't there, Dennis, that wants to proclaim we're free? Isn't there just kind of like that DNA in us that wants to say we're free?
Well, for some, there's the DNA drives us to wanting to be actually free and to proclaim it. And to others, the DNA drives, apparently, to proclaim it, whether or not it's true, and to hold on to a mythological state in their own mind, Mark. But I think what you made a very interesting point as I'm thinking about this, as you were speaking, that it is a transitional situation. The awakening takes time.
Yep.
And the process for people it varies depending on the person and on the situation. And so just as you say, just as with the Molasses Act, that were some people were first waking up to what was going on, and then later, of course, with the general writs of assistance and that sort of thing, and that happened in that era. And then, of course, the Tea Party situation was, I think I remember this right, but the Boston Tea Party was actually a tax reduction. And people say, well, why were they mad about that? Well, really, they were fighting prohibition. The Crown saying you must only drink British tea. And the colonists saying, oh, but we want to decide for ourselves what we're going to drink. And of course, we can think of some interesting parallels today and that sort of thing. But also, and then with the constitutional thing that you brought up. And so we have an interesting scenario now where people have, a lot of our friends will look at the Constitution, and if you say, well, doesn't provide us with the answers. But it does provide us, I think, with some help with the awakening of it. And I know Tom Woods has talked about that, and our friends Michael Bolden and Mike Meharry and Chris Van Hull and Suzanne Sherman and others, they all will reference that and say, well, here's what they take an oath with their hand on the Bible to follow this thing and to uphold it and not go beyond the specifically enumerated and delegated powers. It's helpful, perhaps, in a way to help the educational process, and they get people to realize that they treat this like it's a joke, it's a ritual, and then you see so much usurpation. But oftentimes, and you mentioned about people loving the king, they want the usurpation, and particularly if you can scare people into thinking it's about security, as a for instance, and if they can scare people about the other, and whether you're talking about foreign policy or immigration or all these different areas, if you can get the people worked up to be afraid, they will accept usurpation of power, which St. George Tucker said was a treason against the sovereignty of the people. And they will accept not being free, just keep us safe. And of course, Franklin had his famous quote about that. But I do see this as an area now where people are starting to realize that maybe this thing which is allegedly keeping us safe is actually making us more endangered. And I've seen you, among others, reference this point, that some of the things that people who say they're conservative want, and yet they will favor stronger government, they don't realize it's this stronger centralized government that's pushing some of the very things that they don't like in the first place.
Yeah.
So some of the educational process might be to show how that's occurring, and how if we want to push back against that, the only answer is through decentralization and peaceful political divorce, which is what I think you specialize in.
Yeah, that's really where I've landed, having kind of worked through all the different possible solutions that are out there. I landed right back in the Declaration of Independence because I see exactly the same I see the parallel between their central government, albeit 3,000 miles away, and ours, which for here in Oklahoma is 1,300 miles away. Nevertheless, it is a distant government that is controlling really what we do here in Oklahoma, just like it's controlling Michigan. And we all know it. I mean, we have a certain amount of latitude until we cross a federal court decision or a administrative ruling within some agency or regulatory ruling within some agency or a law passed by Congress. Michigan can only go so far as to reach up to that point where the federal government is acted, and then the federal government almost always wins. So we have to step back at some point and perhaps begin to examine the premise of our ideas that the solutions do reside in the Constitution. Here recently, recently being the past few years, I've really really begun to look for what might be the smoking gun that suggests that the federal government maybe isn't as limited as we think it is constitutionally. Now, I say all that with the backdrop of this. I don't know the motives of those who arrived in Philadelphia in May of 1787. I don't know them personally. How could I? I lived in a different era than they did. I can read books. I can read their own writings, but I can't know their motives. I can't know that for sure. But I can know the actions that they took. And so there are certain elements of the Philadelphia Convention we just have to come to terms with that are just historical facts. So when they arrive and the first order of business is the secrecy rule is passed, we have to step back and say, well, maybe there's two sides to that issue. Maybe there was good reason to pass a secrecy rule, but maybe there wasn't good reason to pass the secrecy rule. But that's one of the first things they do. Then right out of the gate the next Monday, they stand up and Edmund Randolph introduces the Virginia Plan. But the Virginia Plan wasn't created on Sunday night and then delivered Monday morning. It had been thought about probably from the Annapolis Convention that happened that previous September in 1786. Perhaps they had already started talking back then about how are we going to centralize power. Well, if you read the Virginia Plan, it certainly hints at motives, because when you read Resolve number 6 of the Virginia Plan, what is it that they're attempting to do with Resolve 6 of the Virginia Plan that they just introduced in the Philadelphia Convention? They want to give the new legislature negative power or veto power over state legislation. Well, that has to say something. I mean, it has to say they meant something by that. Now, we know that that's not where they ended up, but we know that there were certain actors that were there that were wanting to consolidate this government. So that's just kind of a brief story to say, maybe we need to take a harder look at all this and not just let our sometimes our emotional biases towards our nostalgic view of history drive our thinking and conclusions about where we are. So let's go to Article 1, Section 8, which is almost routinely used by conservatives to say Congress only has 17 or 18, depending how you look at them, enumerated powers. And then, of course, we know the capstone to all that is the 17th or 18th enumerated power, the necessary and proper clause. Chief Justice Marshall calls it eventually the elastic clause. Well, we love the first part of that necessary and proper clause, where it says, and for all the foregoing powers, referring to the previous 16 or 17 powers, depending how you look at it. But there's a comma there. And most conservatives don't quote after the comma, because after the comma, it goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing, and all other delegated powers within this Constitution. Well, that should be a cue to us to say, wait a minute, there's not just 17 powers. There's 17 perhaps enumerated powers for Congress, but there's other powers out there as well. Well, you turn the page to Article 2, Section 2, the article that delegates the power to the executive branch, and you see what's referred to as the Appointments Clause. Well, in the Appointments Clause, the president is responsible to appoint department heads, councils, ambassadors, and then any other government, any other department head that Congress sees fit to appoint. And so you put these two together, you put Article 2, Section 2, Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause after the comma, and lo and behold, you begin to see maybe this government has a lot more power than we think it does, than we have argued that it does. So maybe our arguments are really falling on deaf ears because the ears should be deaf. It is, and it is allowed to be as big as it is. Now, I've had to step back and kind of suspend my nostalgic view of history, and I'm guilty of this as anybody else. And I had to start looking and be as honest with the text as I could to explain how did we get from this, what was supposed to be, what we all think is supposed to be a tiny government that really only, Federalist 45, Madison's telling us it only is limited to few and defined powers. How did we get from there to this thing? Well, there's got to be some answers to that. And it can't just be in Dennis, this is what has been the most disturbing part for me in the past few years, has been seeing the people naturally want to blame the people. They've been so conditioned to believe the Constitution can't be the problem that there must be some other problem out there then. Because if it can't be the Constitution, we have to blame somebody, and so let's blame the people. The people aren't doing their job. Well, what if my contention is right? And by the way, I had a long discussion with the dean of a major law school about this probably a year ago now, and posed this idea to him, and we talked about it, and he concluded that that's certainly a reasonable conclusion from those two sections. So what if my position's right and there is a smoking gun there? Well, maybe we should reduce our constitutional arguments and begin to think of an alternative solution to this. And I kind of think that's where they were in 1774, 5 and 6, Dennis, as they began to appeal to the king and try to persuade him to stop. We all know about the olive branch offer that was given just before Declaration of Independence was declared. They were trying to work within the system, but then came to the realization we can't work within the system. And from that, we now have this famous document, the Declaration of Independence. And that's what leads me to peaceful political divorce. That's where I am. I no longer make constitutional arguments. In fact, the other day I said I was going to ban them on my Facebook page, of course, which was done. I did that just for propaganda purposes, and I like to agitate and get people to get mad at me and think it through, because sometimes in their anger at me, it gives me a chance to say, well, don't be angry at me, let's just talk this through. And I've had a number of great conversations since then because of that. But I really think the option going forward for us is peaceful political divorce from Washington, D.C., regain control of our state borders, and then we can have just all kinds of wonderful discussions about how we deal with security, how we deal with trade, how we deal with movement within the country, how we deal with, I'd rather have those conversations than arguing that, the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8 doesn't permit Washington, D.C. to do X, Y, and Z. And just, I'll close with this, Dennis. The bottom line is it doesn't even matter what we believe anyways. I work there. We have no power, none. If we think our arguments on Facebook win today, maybe amongst our 10 friends, but they have no power whatsoever in Washington, D.C. So.
Well, and I think people are awakening to that.
Me too.
To varying degrees, but it seems to be spreading. But another interesting thing to think about, John.
That's me. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're back.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so another interesting thing to think about is about people getting angry. And as you were going through some of these things, historically, it reminded me that we go back then, whether it's going into the Declaration or the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution and that whole ratification process, there was anger then, and there was divisiveness then.
Yeah.
And in the dim recesses of the public memory, you see the founders. The founders were not a monolithic group, of course.
That's right.
So there were some very different groups involved here. The signers of the Declaration of Independence. There's a big difference between them and the drafters and ratifiers of the Constitution, probably by design, as some pointed out. And of course, Patrick Henry, I've read, Washington wanted him to go with him to Philadelphia, and Henry wouldn't go. And he said, "I smell a rat." So they suspected this, of course. The misnamed, apparently, anti-federalists suspected something was up here. And there were Lysander Spooner's famous writing about this and saying, well, the Constitution either didn't prevent tyranny from happening or it enabled it. In either way, in either case, it's not working. So we look at this and we say, well, do we truly agree with what Jefferson wrote and what was voted on and approved? Apparently with each state, I guess, had one vote, and New York abstained.
Yeah.
And then the other 12 all voted in favor of this, that we have inalienable rights granted by our Creator. And if we do, and I think I agree with that. I think you would agree with that. That would tend to converge with something that Judge Napolitano talks about this whole natural law idea, and the natural law people talked about. He looked at it biblically. The Bible says we are made in His image, in God's image. God is free, therefore we are made naturally free. And therefore, one I believe could say, at least to people of faith, and particularly people of the Christian faith, you could say, well, God joined each human being and their liberty together, and their freedom together. That was okay. So what God has joined together, let no one tear asunder. And if people do try to tear it asunder, then we must resist. And the people that maybe don't share the same faith background, we can say, well, we can be united on this idea that this is just a part of your natural condition, that this is something, and you have this naturally, and it's something to pass on to your progeny, to future generations. So we need to protect it for the people living now and the people to come. And if there is, and this is in the Declaration of Independence, right? If the thing that's supposed to safeguard all these things, allegedly this minarchy, this very small government, this night watchman government, is somehow, oh my gosh, look what happened. Now it's the tyranny that Patrick Henry and George Mason and others warned about. Then we're supposed to end it. And if you look at it from the natural law standpoint, you could, again, I think you could even go back and say, and I know you'll tell me who said this, probably more than one person, but that disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God. So I think there's all these things to wrap together. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's on our Gray Seal, that very phrase. And so this really goes back to John Locke and a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers. Now there's these battles between guys like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke as they're trying to understand, during this period we call the Age of Enlightenment, they're trying to understand man's relationship to government. Because as recorded history shows, we've had all kinds of governments since we've recorded history, from the feudal systems to totalitarian governments to monarchies. We've had attempts at real republics. When you go to the Italian duchies, and the duchies are up in the in Norway and Northern Europe areas where they were true republics. And so we've had all kinds of governments that have been formed, rose, and then fell for a whole host of reasons. And so you come into this Age of Enlightenment, you have people like Hobbes and Locke that are beginning to argue this concept of what's called the state of nature. What is man preceding government? What does he naturally want to do? Now, Hobbes takes a very dim view of man in the state of nature. His view is that a life in the state of nature of mankind is solitary, cold, brutish, and short. That's how he describes it. That's man naturally is going to war with each other. It's in our fallen nature. And to a degree, there's a biblical basis for this. So you can't just dismiss it and say, oh, that's just too negative. He's just too negative, and so we have to dismiss everything Hobbes says. No, there's actually a number of reasons to listen to a lot of things he said. And you have Locke essentially agreeing, but his argument is different. That man is more Aristotelian. Man inherently wants to live in community. We see it first in the family, then we see it in community, then we see it in cities, and they grow larger. And I see that to be true. I see that I want to be married. I want to have kids. I like having neighbors. I naturally gravitate towards community. I'm not a solitary guy who wants to go live in the hills. So I tend to identify with Locke. And so what does Locke begin to argue? The right of revolution, the right of the people to revolt against their government when the government goes tyrannical. And so we know that many of the writers of the Declaration understood this. They're right in the midst of this Enlightenment period, and they're getting it. We're going to revolt against the king. We have the right of revolution. And out comes the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because Jefferson then argues in the Declaration of Independence, when the government fails in its one sole duty, which is to secure unalienable rights, it is the right and the duty of the people. It is the right of the people to alter, abolish it, or throw it off. Later on down in the document, he calls it the duty of the people. Now, I kind of think duty is a better word to use versus the right, because let's be honest, if we are created by God with unalienable rights, or as Napolitano would argue, because of our humanity, we possess these rights. then I think when you have a gift like that, there becomes a stewardship issue at play here. And that starts to speak to duty. So I have a duty as the father and husband of my family to manage our finances well. It's not just something I should do. I have a wife and 4 kids. Well, they're all adult now, but when I was raising them, I had a wife and 4 kids that were counting on me managing my household well. That speaks far more to duty than just I should. Well, I think it's the same way with our liberties. I think we have to move from, well, we can, or we have the freedom to entertain Lockean right to revolution. I think Jefferson's got it more right, that we actually have a duty to stop this. Because let's look at really what our lack of following Jefferson's remedy, if you will, within the Declaration has led to. 63 million legally murdered babies. That's a Holocaust that transcends any Holocaust throughout our history, recorded human history. We have $22 trillion of stolen money on our children and I've got 6 grandchildren, Dennis. I know you probably have grandchildren. We've sentenced them to a life that to a prison, and the warden is Washington, D.C. We steal roughly $3 trillion. We suck it out of the economy and then send it into that 10-mile square swampland in Washington, D.C. every single year. We borrow another $1 trillion just to pay our bills. And so if you apply some kind of moral metric to that, you've got, from a Christian perspective, you've got a violation of the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. You've got a violation of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Well, now Jefferson uses the term duty. Well, perhaps it should inform our thinking a little differently. That it shouldn't just be, well, it might be a good idea to follow his remedy. It's the right and the duty of the people to alter, abolish, or throw off this government that is failing in its one singular duty, which is to secure unalienable rights. Obviously, ours is doing much more than that. Maybe it's more than just we should consider it. I think Jefferson's probably more right with the word duty. We are duty bound to do this because we're murdering innocent babies to the tune of 3,000 a day. We're stealing billions of dollars. Dennis, think of the $3 trillion left in the economy. What would happen to research and design? What would happen to capital expenditures? What would happen to job creation? What would happen to entrepreneurship? It would explode. But no. Obligation, law, if you will, forces us to cough up $3 trillion every year. And what do we get in exchange for? What's the great exchange we get from this? So my involvement in politics has moved from my days of Dr. Walter Williams and really opening my mind back in 1999 with his article, It's Time to Part Company. That really began my pilgrimage to meeting Tom Woods and Don Livingston and all these guys and beginning really to press my thinking on this stuff. And honestly, one of the most challenging moments was getting on the air one day and needing to admit to my audience that I was largely wrong in everything I had been saying, and I was sorry. I was just wrong. I didn't mean to be wrong. I just was. And but because of some good thinkers like Tom and Marshall DeRosa and Brian McClanahan and Don Livingston and guys and it helped me straighten my thinking out, Dennis. And now I argue a lot more philosophically than I do, the status quo.
Well, that's excellent. And that's a path that it's a personal path for everybody. And you've just laid out your own personal path, and I think that's exemplary and something for people to ponder and perhaps emulate. And as you were going through the litany, I think to myself, the long train of abuses that exists now far outshines or overwhelms what Jefferson wrote about. And in fact, you talk about from the financial standpoint, not just the $22 trillion, but the unfunded contingent liabilities, which sober people like is it Kotlikoff from Boston University? He says it's like $200 trillion plus. I know. And then there's something else that the founders talked about, and this ties in. The founders, sorry, but men like Washington and Jefferson, and I think Madison discussed this, but and ties into something that you raised. We had this horrible the Holocaust of the unborn, but we also have, again, the wars.
I know.
They call it foreign policy. It's really a phrase for ripping off people here at home in order to create mayhem overseas for the benefit of a small group of powerful special interests, foreign and domestic. And it leads to a number of very bad consequences. One is excess death that would not have occurred otherwise. The numbers are huge, and it becomes staggering when you start to add all these situations together. You also have another point, and something that Jefferson said, that we don't have the right to bind future generations. And when you talk about it from the financial standpoint, I would suggest there's another area. These entangling alliances, including situations where there is no actual treaty of alliance, but for political reasons. We are told by people in power and people that want power that we must have an unending bond with a foreign country. Excuse me. And so what ends up happening is, what they attempt to do is use the legal process to put on the backs of people too young to vote, as well as those yet to be born, a duty and an obligation, not to defend their God-given liberty, but to be involved in overseas conflicts, which again benefits special interests of foreign and domestic, and things that, if it weren't for this, would have no impact on them. But it's a terrible abuse of the young people and of the unborn, and some of the people that advocate for this claim to be advocates for the unborn, and on the abortion issue, they tend to be very good. But on this, they tend to have a blind spot. But what's happened is we have this gigantic Leviathan state, which has such an impact on our lives, and has such power and control in so many ways, financially and otherwise, that we then see very powerful, financially powerful people come in. And in one case, there's a person that apparently he's donated $258 million through his various organizations to various politicians, and he's driving a lot of the foreign policy discussion in Washington today, and a lot of things that have actually happened, to the detriment of everybody else here in this country. And if we don't have the peaceful political divorce that you're talking about, Mark, I see no other way of beating this, because if we try to win these elections at the federal level, and now I'm speaking in Kreslin-esque dialogue here. You talked about this on the abortion issue, and folks, please hear this. This is very important. If we do it in the centralized, federalized situation, nationalized situation, we'll never win. No. And we need to have the peaceful political divorce so that these grasping special interests cannot win one battle and then control everybody. It's analogous to with Ireland being decentralized. It's a fascinating story. When they were invaded by the Vikings and by the English, the Irish had a secret weapon. They were so decentralized that when the invaders beat the one king or the one leader, and they thought, oh, great, we've just conquered this whole country. Oh, no, there's far more to do here. And the Vikings evidently never did really conquer Ireland. They had their outposts and they did their raiding and terrible things. And the English eventually did conquer, but it was a lot tougher than they anticipated. For that reason, and politically, we need to do something similar for that reason. And there was also, and the other point why this is important, and Mark has written about this regarding the abortion issue, and this becomes a big point. And the great Dr. Ron Paul talked about this, how, for instance, abortion was not delegated to the feds. Okay, and I understand we're not making it a constitutional thing, but here maybe we just point that out to people that say that they follow that, but also a practical thing. It's very difficult to win the battle to save the unborn, again, at that nationalized level. We tend not to do it. And people make this mistake of putting off, the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade, and they didn't have, and Dr. Paul says, the Congress should have told they could have, but Congress didn't, that the Supreme Court should not have been even dealing with that. But at the state level, if we have the peaceful political divorce, and on that issue at the state level, you can save a lot of the babies, right? You were saying in some states like Oklahoma, and others, maybe Texas and Arkansas and some others, all right? People would complain, well, what about babies in other states? Well, if we do it in the nationalized way, we save none of them.
Right.
But by decentralizing, we can save millions. And I think we can take the lesson from that to a lot of other issues, too, why your effort and what you're enlightening people to, which is the peaceful political divorce and this decentralization, actually holds great hope and great promise for improved lives and a much better chance of living in a free society.
Brother, I'm 100% with you there. And what I'm seeing more and more, having been in the peaceful political divorce game or secession game for well over a decade now, I've been making these arguments. But I've seen the ball move tremendously. I think people are growing exhausted trying to defend the indefensible. Now, as you know, there's two terms really that you can apply to Washington, D.C. It's a de facto government or it's a de jure government. A de jure government is a government of the law. It actually follows and restrains itself by the law. Well, guess what we don't have?
We don't have that.
We don't have it. We have a de facto government, but we've had a de facto government, and this is where it gets challenging for people, all the way back to 1794, when President Washington called up 13,000 troops and marched them into western Pennsylvania without a shred of constitutional authority. So the de facto mindset appeared very quickly. Now, I'm not going to argue whether they should have created a more central government or not. I didn't live in 1790s or late 1780s, early 1790s. Maybe there's good reasons we needed a stronger central government back then, but we don't need one now. It's becoming more and more difficult to defend the need for a quote-unquote national government. I cannot see any real good, compelling reasons to your issue related to war. We don't declare war. In fact, we don't really have a Department of Defense. We have a Department of Offense. And I wrote my congressman years ago and asked him to put in legislation to change the name of the DOD to the DOO and call it what it really is, the Department of Offense. We use military might to execute foreign policy when we should be using diplomacy, discussions, trade, those sorts of things. We use military force to compel behaviors that we want. Well, that shreds the Constitution. If any one thing does, and there's plenty of things that shred the Constitution, but that's one. There's no declarations of wars. What do? We use clever little terms like authorization of use of military force. We now pass those in exchange, instead of passing true declarations of war that would involve the people. So we have a de facto government that is untethered itself from anything. It never was tethered to the Constitution, the written document. It never constrained itself by that. It's untethered itself from the people, and it uses very clever language every 2 years to persuade us to go one more time and vote for them to have power. But it's becoming increasingly difficult, even for my most ardent conservative constitutional friends, to defend the need for a national government. In fact, there are far more reasons to say we have no need of a national government at all whatsoever, and we'd be much better served by having regional governments that represent the actual diversity within the country. This idea that we're one nation under God, indivisible, is just propaganda that we've bought. And Don Livingston reminds me all the time, Dennis, when he and I talk, he says, Mark, you have got to remember, because he knows sometimes I push the envelope a little farther than perhaps I should. He says, Mark, you've got to, in that warm Southern gentleman dialect he has, he says, Mark, you've got to remember, these people have stood up in front of the flag since their kindergarten days. They put their right hands over their heart and they pledged allegiance. You cannot ask them to go from there to here in a matter of days. They can't. They've got to think it through, just as I had to think it through. So you've heard the old saying, when the preacher points out to the congregation with one finger, he's pointing three back at himself, and Don routinely reminds me of my need to remember I got three fingers pointing back at myself. Yes, it was a pilgrimage for me, but I do find that it's harder and harder for even the most ardent constitutionalists to give a defense for the legitimacy of a continuation of Washington, D.C. I would prefer just lining up a bunch of bulldozers and pushing it right into the Chesapeake Bay. That would be, if I could do it, I'd line them up on 16th Street and just have them push east until the thing was gone. We don't need it. We don't really need it.
That would delight Lou Rockwell, whose birthday was yesterday. He calls it Mortar on the Potomac, right?
It is.
Right. Well, and boy, a couple of great things come to mind here that you just referenced. Well, one of the, first of all, the Pledge of Allegiance. All the audience members, some will already know about this, but Google Francis or don't Google, DuckDuckGo Francis Bellamy. Who is Francis Bellamy? You better read who he was and what they were really trying to do, and see the Pledge of Allegiance as an anti-Jeffersonian thing, a piece of political propaganda, and to push what could only be described as a centralizing progressive agenda. And as Tom Woods likes to say, it's fascinating but heartbreaking at times to see how often people that consider themselves conservative or on the right will defend the gains made by the left because they've been indoctrinated in them. And this is a great example of it. And that you read the history of Francis Bellamy, and you look at those words, and one nation indivisible, absolutely not. What do you think the whole American Revolution, or I should say secession, from the British Empire was about, right?
Yeah,
and the article, and all these different things. And then the other thing, and also the late, extremely great William N. Grigg. And and people should study him and read about him. But he made a great point. I hadn't even thought about this until I saw him write this. The word allegiance comes from the French word liege, which means lord. So for the Christians among us, among others, we're supposed to just have one Lord. So what are you doing having an allegiance to anything or any organization or any piece of cloth other than Jesus Christ?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And
no, Dennis is
right. And then Dr. Livingstone, or Professor Livingstone, he has written great stuff, including about republics. We talk about Republican government, and he says how size matters. And so this is interesting. What you're talking about, the regional governments or the decentralized, and they looked at this issue in antiquity. And apparently the idea was there's only a certain landmass over which you could really have Republican government, and only a certain number of people. Some people think more than 3 million, and you lose all the Republican characteristics.
You do. Now, Don's made a great case, and this has kind of been his shtick going forward the last 15, 20 years, has been scale matters. And I think it's really the least offensive way to talk about this, because we know, as Aristotle said, everything in creation has a scale to it that makes it properly or function properly. So, for example, why do we eat with a fork and not a pitchfork? They're shaped the same, right? They both have handles, they have tongs. But we don't eat with a pitchfork because it's out of scale. It doesn't fit in our mouth. So we scale it down to a useful function. We scale it down to the size we can go like this. Why do our heads turn when we see limousines on the road? Why do we naturally, instinctively see a 40-foot limousine and we go like that? Because it's out of scale. Our normal scale is a 12-foot vehicle and 4 doors at max. And we're used to that. And think of our parking garages, how big they would have to be, our streets, how big they would have to be if we all drove limousines. So what do car manufacturers do? They create a car to scale that fits. Well, if you apply human scale to government, it also has a size at which it can no longer function, especially within the context of a representative form of government. And obviously, 535 sociopaths trying to govern 320 million people is way out of scale. There's no possible way. One person representing the average size of the congressional district today is 750,000 people. How can that possibly represent 750,000 people? As you know, probably, Dennis, in the Constitution, Madison argued for one representative for every 30,000 people. That perhaps is the high end of representation. But Don also then argues for human scale in terms of geography. It's the progressives that love the idea that we're a nation, that we're a monolithic nation united by a set of principles. I ask people all the time, list those uniting principles for us. And of course I get crickets, because there are no principles that we actually, 320 million people, agree on. And so it's ludicrous to think we're even a consolidated nation. Yet 90% of my conservative friends that are engaged in this pilgrimage that they're on will still knee-jerk refer to these United States, plural, as a singular monolithic nation. It's just been inbred in us. It took me years, Dennis, before I could purge that word out of my vocabulary. I don't use it anymore. And when I use it, I talk about it in the pejorative. But the propagandists have been very good. But a nation of 320 million people governed by 535 people, that's maniacal to even imagine that makes any sense. I mean, there's something wrong with you to think that makes sense. But that's the power of propaganda and indoctrination and conditioning. We've been trained to believe that that's how it's supposed to be. And so Don comes along with this Aristotelian scale argument and said for anything to have proper function, it has to be within scale. Otherwise, we should all go go out in our sheds and get our pitchforks and try to eat with it. You're not going to be very successful at it. Well, it's the same thing with having a small government, a small group of people trying to govern 320 million people. Nothing good comes from that. So what's the solution? We go back to republics, actual republics. And there's a distinction between republics and republicanism. Republicanism within the context of republics is fine. But if republicanism merely means representative form of government. But you can't have representative form of government in this thing. You could have representative form of government in a small republic. Now, Aristotle said republics really shouldn't be any more than 100,000 people. Plato said they shouldn't be any bigger than 20,000 people. Well, imagine that. Now, in the United States, this has been my advocacy for the last few years, Dennis. In the United States, we've got 3,108 counties. So on average, there's about 30 to 40,000 people in counties, even counties that are in large cities, that break up large cities. Now imagine if we had 3,108 republics. At least at that point, you would have a better representation of the diversity in that republic, of the culture of that republic. They would have their own form of government. Maybe some of them would want direct democracy. Maybe some would give anarchy a whirl. Maybe some would go right back to a centralized, powerful government. But at least you would appreciate diversity, and you would allow it to form itself into its own kinds of government. Now, I say this, and perhaps some of your people that watch this are going to think that's crazy talk. Well, it would be crazy talk if it was never tried before, but it's actually been tried before. Switzerland has a very decentralized form of government right now. They've broken into 26 cantons. Built into their constitution is the principle of subsidiarity, which generally just says the decisions never bump up to the next level that can be solved at the local level. So taxing power happens at the local level. It doesn't happen like ours does in Washington, D.C. And so, for example, a good example of how this works in Switzerland, during their suffrage movement, it kind of parallels ours, the cantons allowed women voting at different speeds. I think the first, I may be wrong on this exact date, but I think the first one was in the 20s. The first canton allowed women to vote, and it was like the 1940s or 1950s before the last canton allowed voting. Now, the women in the first one were probably up in arms. How dare those other 25 not pass the right for women to vote? And they agitated, and they agitated, and they agitated, so that by 30 years later, all the women are voting in Switzerland. Well, that was built into their constitution. This separation, this allowance for diversity, this allowance for the pace of change to occur that respects the cultural differences, and so that's where I'm headed for, Dennis. I'm not stuck in the past anymore. I'm free of the past. I don't think the solutions are in the Constitution. I think the solutions are in the Declaration. I think it's in decentralizing power. I have many, many liberal friends. I have got friends that are involved in the Cal Exit movement. They are about as left as you can be out there. But you know what I tell Marcus? I say, Marcus, please, when you guys get free, just keep your borders open so we can come and trade with you. We can come and visit you and take vacations on the Pacific Ocean. We can come see your beautiful forest. And you know what his response back to me is? Of course. You see, it's only Washington, D.C. that likes to keep us here at each other's throats. Marcus and California, I love those people out there. I'm a Christian, number one. My first obligation to them is the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. It is not to make them do what I want them to do if I can get political power. That's a warped view in many ways, if you ask me. But what I would like to do is go break bread with Marcus out there, and perhaps, share in some of his cuisine out there, and trade my daughter's product she's creating with them out there. It's that kind of living, Dennis. If we all examine our lives, that's how we actually do live. That's why here in the past few years, I've really begun to think a lot more about the whole idea of voluntarism, the whole idea of anarchy, because you know what? As I've examined it, Dennis, that's actually how I live my life. The only person that screws up my life, usually has a badge on him when I get my regular seatbelt ticket for not wearing my seatbelt. They usually have a badge on them, or they have some official letterhead that says you can't do this. They're the only ones that screw with my life. I go to Lowe's, I walk in, I need a light bulb. The guy says, oh, let me show you where they are. He takes me over there, because then I go to the cash register, I take out my wallet, I give money, they're happy, I'm happy. We live our lives as voluntarists. We're just told that the only reason we do is because we have government, which is a lie from the pits of hell. I don't not steal from my neighbor because of government. I don't steal from my neighbor, and he doesn't steal from me because we're neighbors. So,
and you know, it'd be wrong. Your own personal,
exactly,
following the Bible and that sort of thing. Right. Well, and that's a great point. So people listening, some of them might say anarchy. Remember, so like as Tolkien and others said, anarchy, it's not whiskered men throwing bombs or hooligans.
Right.
It's the same rules for everybody, but no special privileges for a ruling class or a ruling class, a caste of people in something called government, which they made up. It's just, that sort of thing. So acting voluntarily and peacefully and cooperatively is what that's all about. And express personal consent. So that's a very interesting point for us to finish up on here, that people might want to study that. And again, when you look at it, we have so much anarchy in our daily lives, including getting up in the morning, because you're not physically forced to do it. Yes, there's a consequence if you don't get up and go to work, but it was a voluntary arrangement that you made. And so acting voluntarily and doing unto others as you would have done unto you, the golden rule, the non-aggression principle, liberty, libertarianism, anarchy, these are actually wonderful things, and most of your life is living like that. And as you say, the problems we get are those that use either statism or the initiation of the use of force, or they have that monopoly on the initiation of violence, which is the legal monopoly, which is, I guess, a definition for the state, right?
That's it.
Anyway, I really appreciate your time. So the action items for the audience would be study the Declaration of Independence and the philosophies that informed the writers of that.
Absolutely, guys. We're moving into philosophical territory now. We are not. As I discussed with somebody just today, I said the questions going forward are not legal questions. They are going to be political questions, just as we're seeing in Brexit right now. We're watching this real time. We're watching a political issue be resolved. The issue is they're seceding from the European Union, and there's all kinds of tension and all kinds of stuff going on in the background, but they're not appealing to law for the permission to do this. Great Britain has said by a vote of 17,400,000 people, we are exercising our political, unalienable right to free association, which is away from the EU. Pay close attention to Nigel Farage, Daniel Hannan, all those guys over there in Brexit. Listen to their arguments. They're making the same arguments we need to be making down the road. Learn the Declaration of Independence. Read John Locke's Treatise on Two Governments. Read about David Hume. Read Plato's cave theory. Understand that those are going to inform our future a lot more than Article 1, Section 8, or Article 4, or Article 5, or Article 6. They're going to be the path forward, folks, and we need to be able to make good arguments for our fellow man to free their minds. So, thank you, Dennis, for having me on.
You're welcome, Mark. And Frederick Bastiat, too, right, with the law. And
Bastiat, sure.
Well, Mark, again, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. I'm hopeful that we can do this again sometime.
Happily.
And we want to thank you for being the inaugural guest on Curmudgeonly Conversations. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, brother.
Bye-bye.